Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the 27th Legislative District Virtual Town Hall. Tonight, you will be hearing from your three state legislators, Speaker Laurie Jinkins, Representative Jake Fye, and Senator Yasmin Trudeau. Before we get started, just a quick word. Representative Fye is currently still in Transportation Committee, working on moving the transportation package forward and should be joining us as soon as that wraps up. So we're going to hold our transportation-related questions until he's able to log on. This is a town hall that's focused on the 2022 legislative session, which began on January 10th and is scheduled to conclude on March 10th. Many of the questions we'll be discussing tonight were submitted in advance by all of you through the survey linked on the legislators' e-newsletters and on Facebook. But you can also post questions in the comments section, and a staff member will make sure that your question gets through to the legislators. So I'm going to turn it over to them for some brief opening remarks, starting with Speaker Laurie Jinkins.
Thank you, Jen, and it's wonderful to be here with everybody. I actually can't wait till we can physically be in person and do another town hall in person again. And I'm hoping that's going to come up really quickly, really soon. Things are looking much better. In this really short 60-day session in which we're sprinting for the entire 60 days, the House Democrats have really focused on four big areas that we're trying to do work in. The first is strengthening Washingtonians' economic well-being. One of the things we know is that when we have economic challenges, a lot of people who move into an economically challenging time and are in a good position when they start are in a good position when they come out. But a lot of people who are not in a great position going into it really end up much worse off coming out. And we want to make sure everybody improves as we come out of this pandemic. So just as an example, for example, the last bill we passed before House of Origin cutoff was a 1% student loan bill, which will be the lowest student loan rate that any student in Washington can get a loan in order to go on to an apprenticeship or higher education or whatever their next step may be. So that's just one of many, many things we're doing in that area. The second priority we have is making sure that we're serving Washingtonians better. And let me just give a couple of examples here. One is I've heard from a lot of you that catalytic converter theft is a big issue. So Rep. Ryu had a bill that we just passed off of the floor that'll require that anyone who buys a catalytic converter must get proof that it's coming from the person who owned the car that the catalytic converter is coming from. And that will drive down demand for these catalytic converters. Also, Representative Rule had a great bill to add more nurses and counselors and social workers to our school system. So we can talk more about that a little later. Our third priority is one that'll stay on our priority list for a long time because it's taken us a long time to get where we're at, and that is advancing racial equity and justice. And a couple of big things that we've done here are, one, we passed a bill of Representative Orwell's that is a language access bill in the K through 12 system to make sure that all parents can really engage in the K-12 system on behalf of their kids and help their kids be successful. We also did a great digital equity bill that was prime sponsored by Rep. Gregerson to make sure that that more people have access to the internet and to the equipment to get on the internet. And then it's amazing, both in rural areas and in urban areas, we have a lot of people who can't actually access the internet. So this bill will help with that. And then finally, I see Rep. Fye has joined us. Our fourth priority has been addressing climate change. And we passed a lot of good bills already this session over to the Senate to make our appliances more clean and more efficient, to do that with our buildings and make them cleaner. But honestly, the biggest climate bill that we are going to do is going to be the transportation package that Rep. Fye has spent the last over a year working on. So anyway, we're happy to talk more about all of those things as we go on. And I talked a little longer than I should have, but I wanted to make sure that you knew kind of the thematic areas that we were really focused on.
All right, should we go right into questions, or would Senator Trudeau or Representative Fye like to say any opening remarks before we take the first question?
I'd be happy to offer some opening remarks. Just wanted to make sure I was following the cue of the program.
Go right ahead.
Thank you. It's really great to be here with everybody today. Newest state senator for the 27th, Yasmin Trudeau. Just want to offer that it really is an honor to step in the footsteps of my predecessor, Senator Jeannie Darneal, to carry forward her legacy as a privilege, but also to bring my professional experience as an attorney and someone who's represented our state's attorney general, and my lived experience as a survivor of violence and product of our state's social service investments, to bring all that into the Senate and to serve with two just highly regarded and esteemed colleagues in Representative Fye and Speaker Jinkins. I serve on 3 committees: Housing and Local Government, Human Services, Reentry and Rehabilitation, and Law and Justice, where I serve as the vice chair, which was a honor and also a surprise as a new member to have that opportunity. 2 areas that I look at, and I'll focus a little bit more on sort of my priorities as a new state senator, because you obviously have all the wisdom and knowledge from the chair of transportation and the speaker to talk about priorities from the Democratic caucus more broadly. But I sort of focus on 2 buckets when I think about what types of public policy I want to support, and that's whether it increases opportunity and whether it decreases disparities. So whatever subject matter that's in. And so I took that and I introduced 11 bills this session, which focused on a few key areas. I won't go over each bill, but happy to answer any questions. Focusing on voting justice and increasing trust and engagement in our democracy, which I think everyone here can agree is just really, really important right now, almost more than ever. Maternal fetal health, behavioral health, lowering barriers for housing access, youth homelessness, affordable housing, public health integration and responses to criminal justice data, and economic empowerment. So it's been amazing to see the historic and incredible investments in the operating and capital budget, which I'm also happy to answer questions about, but specifically as they address the issues of homelessness and housing, which I know is really important statewide, but hits home for many of us right here in Tacoma and across the 27th. So excited to connect with you all and answer your questions and thoughts that you have on issues that I'm working on, or anything I can answer more broadly about work and priorities in the Senate. So thanks, everyone.
Okay, I hope everybody can hear me. I don't have a lot of volume on what I can hear, but I've been able to make out what the good senator and the speaker has said. I just want to say 2 things. These are this meeting, this town hall is to hear from you. So I'm going to be short. The second is what a wonderful experience it is to work with the speaker and with our new senator. Let me assure you that we talk a lot and that we work together to make sure that the various topics that are important to our district are addressed by at least one of us, sometimes more than one of us. I'm still in Olympia because I just had a committee meeting that ended a bit late on some very important progress on our transportation work, very important work for Pierce County, but also very important work for the whole state of Washington, that will address a lot of environmental issues that the state has with respect to fish passage, that will put more emphasis on preserving and maintaining the existing highway system that we have today, an emphasis on our ferry system. We have a ferry landing here in Tacoma, but we have a ferry system that's struggling and makes important investments in workforce and in new vessels. And we have projects that are in this package that will address the finishing of both the Port of Tacoma Road and also Highway 167 into the Port of Tacoma, but as well a number of multimodal items in the package reflecting both transit and active transportation, so that people will have choices here in Pierce County about how to get to their important destinations, regardless of their means, their ability to afford traditional transportation systems. We want to make a transportation system that works for everyone, and in particularly one that is equitable and does not put disadvantaged communities once again at the end of the line in terms of being able to serve disadvantaged communities in a way that other communities in the state have been served. So I'm happy to listen to your questions, and thank you for the opportunity and for listening into our town hall.
All right. We are going to go right into our first question, which comes from Mary. And Mary is asking, I hear state lawmakers proposed a new state budget. What does that mean for us in Tacoma?
Maybe I'll kick off with that, Mary, and say, first of all, folks should know that both the House and the Senate released their budgets this week. Now their operating budgets. We also have a capital budget, which is really about construction, and those were released this week. And Representative Fye also released his supplemental transportation budget, which is different than the package he just talked about. So there are 3 budgets that get released by each the House and the Senate. Then we work on those budgets in our bodies and move them off of our respective floors. And then we start working together to come up with one combined budget. Our budget writers this year, because again, we've had such a short session, and we are very lucky because our economy has done so well that we've had significant revenue to deal with. And we still have quite a bit of money left from the federal government that they sent out to states last year. So we have a very robust operating budget. And that's what I'm going to talk about. The operating budget is the budget that funds schools and behavioral health and things like that. But we have been we've been able in the House, and actually I'm sure Senator Trudeau will say this for the Senate too. We have really been able to invest wisely in making sure that we do what I talked about early on, which is making sure that everyone comes out of this strong. So there's a lot of money invested in protecting housing and providing food assistance and assistance with utilities so that people's basic needs are being met in this state. In the House budget, also significant investments in our K-12 system across the state, which will affect Tacoma a lot, as will the basic needs investments. We also funded a lot of rate increases for people who work in many different areas that are important to us. Everything from teachers to our behavioral health workers, to our long-term care workforce, and to those who are doing outreach and work with unhoused people. So lots, because we've had incredible shortages in those areas. And one of the issues is that those folks are just not paid enough to retain them in the workforce. We've also done work in the budget on expanding healthcare access. And let me tell you, even though it looks like COVID is on the way out, we continue to invest in public health to make sure that it actually doesn't just look that way, it is on the way out. And we keep our eyes on that. And then we finally, both the House and the Senate budgets transfer $2 billion, yes, that's a B, $2 billion to the transportation package that Jake talked about. And in the House, over $700 million into the capital budget so that we can do more work on housing is primarily what that money is being used for. So that's the House budget.
I'm happy to just give some quick highlights on the Senate budget. So we can talk about, so how things apply here in the 27th, but big picture, I want to offer that in the Senate budget, there's about $100 million to increase access to Lifeline for people across the state through connections, childcare, behavioral health, child visitation and in-home care, $75 million from Farmers to Families Food Box Program for fresh and healthy food to food banks across the state, $41 million to help transition people who are currently encamped into actual supportive and permanent housing, $38 million to increase financial supports for people eligible for age blind or disabled programs, $9 million to expand basic food expansions, and $4 million to assist tenant and landlord issues, which obviously are really relevant as we've gone through this pandemic. So I'm happy to speak to capital, but wanted to give Representative Fye an opportunity if he wanted to talk transportation or operating budget before we move over to capital.
Thank you, Senator. The transportation budget, absent the influx of money from both federal infrastructure money and the $2 billion from the operating budget. Other than that, our revenues are down. And so our efforts are to put additional spending, including the $2 billion from the general fund and also the money from the federal infrastructure package. Otherwise, we're pretty much in a steady state, but we do have funded a couple of things. As you know, the homeless crisis has a big impact throughout society, and the transportation system is not immune from that. What you'll see in the regular supplemental budget is an investment with the city of Fife to help them deal very compassionately with the homeless challenges they have. Fully a quarter of the city of Fife has property that's owned by the Department of Transportation. So the homeless crisis hits the city of Fife in a big way. So we're providing $1 million of resources to both WashDOT and the city of Fife to compassionately work with those that are homeless on property that needs to be vacated in order to build Highway 167 into the Port of Tacoma. So that's one thing we are doing. We're also going to be putting additional funding in collaboration with the Department of Social and Health Services to do a collaborative effort to address homelessness, again, in a compassionate, organized fashion that will work to focus our efforts to help people that are in current encampments on the Department of Transportation right away. Otherwise, all the funding depends upon the package that comes from that we're working on as well. But we are trying to do something to deal with the condition of our homeless population and to act in a cooperative fashion with other agencies to address individual needs.
All right. And just a reminder for folks, this is a live virtual town hall with your 27th district legislators. Submit your questions in the comments section. Next question comes from Heather. Heather's asking, what is happening with education this year, especially for kids who are struggling during the pandemic?
Well, I'm happy to start off talking about that briefly. We've done on the budget. I think the budget is on all of our minds, and maybe after I answer this, Senator Trudeau can go back and talk a little bit about the capital budget too. But so let me just talk a little bit about what we're doing for education. We invested almost $1 billion in education just for this one supplemental year, right? This is the state budgets work on a biennium, 2 years. Last year was the first year. So this will be the second year. So another almost $1 million invested in education. One of those things is to stabilize enrollment and transportation funding. Because students have been in and out of school over the last year, our school district funding for schools might go down because it doesn't show as many students in school. And so we've made sure to equalize, to put money in to make sure that our schools aren't losing funding over that. I've also mentioned teacher shortages and salaries for teachers, and teachers have really been frontline workers over this last year in so many ways. And so we also included salary, cost of living increases for our teachers. We put money into school nutrition for the next year. One of the great things we did, I just got a whole stack of letters of like 50 or 60 letters from fifth graders at Sherman Elementary here in the district about outdoor school and outdoor education. We funded more outdoor education and also increased our dual credit program and our cap on the Running Start program to help our older students who want to go to community and technical college while they're getting their high school diploma. So those are just some of the areas that we've worked on. And I talked a little bit about the language access bill too at the beginning. Senator Trudeau, do you want to just bounce back to Capitol and talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Yeah, I'm happy to do that. So we had some really historic investments in capital budget as described before. I'll kind of go over the high level and then a couple of specific projects that we were able to get in. Some are in the Senate and some are in the House. And as is normal, there'll be some negotiating, but I feel really good about the specific projects in the 27th. So right now in the Senate capital budget, there's about $500 million dedicated specifically to housing, $120 million dedicated specifically to broadband infrastructure, about $330 million invested into water, and $115 million into school seismic safety. So making sure that we're creating, retrofitting and creating adequate structures should there be any issues with earthquakes or other natural disasters. So as far as our specific projects in the 27th that we've been collaborating on as a team, is there's about $5 million in each budget right now, so pretty close in the amounts when it comes to local and community projects here in the 27th, including Foss Waterway Seaport, Tacoma Recovery Cafe, Titlow Park Bridge replacement, planning land acquisition for veteran rights, Dash Point Pier, and other minor works projects. So those are just some opportunities to highlight some of the specific investments that are going to come here in the 27th. But again, a lot of the stuff that's in capital and in operating will be accessible and applicable in the 27th. Just wanted to highlight a few specific projects.
All right. We're going to go to question number 3 from Stephen. Stephen is asking, is there new funding for affordable housing and to address the homelessness crisis?
I feel like I'm happy to take that, but I might be repeating myself again. But you heard of the investments in both, the Senate and the House on the operating and capital side have really done an amazing job at focusing not only on making sure that we have an increase in housing stock, but also related to affordable housing accessibility and making sure that we've got behavioral health supports and supportive transitional housing so that we can keep people housed to prevent homelessness, but also be able to provide affordable housing. One of the bills that I dropped it's a tax deferral bill, but it really focuses on the opportunity to address what's here in terms of unused surface lots and parking lots. And so it's a development incentive that would require 50% workforce and affordable housing to address an issue I think we all are familiar with here in the city of Tacoma and other similarly situated cities. So those are a couple of things I'd offer and defer to the speaker and Chair Fye if they've got anything else.
I would just add in terms of affordable housing, we passed a bill off the floor and it's now in the Senate. Hopefully it will do well to require all cities of Washington. I'm sure it has a size limit, but of a certain size to allow for ADUs. Some people think of them as mother-in-law apartments and things like that. This is to create more density and more availability for housing. Because one of the problems we have with affordable housing is we just don't have enough housing in Washington at all right now at any level. So we've got to get more dense and find ways to construct more housing. The other thing that that the House budget does is provides some incentives for cities to engage in the work that the city of Tacoma, the Tacoma City Council did in terms of missing middle housing and work with their communities to see what they can do to, again, get more affordable housing constructed, bring more density and get some of this missing middle housing going. So those are just a couple of examples of the work that we're doing there.
All right. The next question comes from Tiffany. Tiffany is asking about hospital bills. Are lawmakers doing anything about giant hospital bills, especially ones that are a surprise that you get 5 or 6 months later?
Yeah, Tiffany, I'm going to talk about this because while I don't serve on committees anymore, I spent nearly a decade on the healthcare committee and worked in this area a lot. There's a few things we're doing. One, Tara Simmons kind of took over from me and is working on charity care bills. We've moved a charity care bill over to the Senate, which will mean that the bill, I believe, I think it's either if you're at 400 or 500% of the federal poverty level, all hospitals in Washington state will provide charity care. So that's going to really help a huge portion of people. A couple of years ago, we know that medical bankruptcies are a huge issue, and we passed a bill on collections for medical bills, really addressing those issues so that we don't have people forced into medical bankruptcy. And then the Representative Cody, the chair of our healthcare committee, last year passed a balanced billing bill, and then in the interim, which is the surprise bills that you're talking about. It's also called balanced billing. The federal government also passed a bill. So we have a bill right now that aligns Washington state standards along with the federal government standards to make sure that we can catch that kind of surprise billing. And let me tell you, I just had a retinal detachment surgery, and anyway, I've been paying attention to whether or not I'm going to be surprise billed. So I'm paying a lot of attention to that myself right now.
All right, we had a question come in from our YouTube channel. This comes from Chris. Chris is just asking if you can basically repeat what the catalytic converter theft bill does that was mentioned earlier.
Yeah, Chris. So you can look this up too on the legislative website. It's House Bill 1815, and it was prime sponsored by Representative Cindy Ryu. And so what it does is put the responsibility on metal purchasers it requires them to get documentation that a catalytic converter came from the vehicle that is registered in the seller's name. Right, so that somebody can't be selling catalytic converters and not have proof that they own the vehicle that it came from. And so that we thought it's already obviously illegal, but this is another way to drive down demand for those metals. Rep. Ryu got this idea because she went to a national conference of legislators, and this was one of the kind of best practices that she learned at the conference and brought it back here to Washington.
So I would add that more work needs to be done, and we're funding in the transportation budget a task force that we were working over the next year to come up with some additional recommendations to address the obvious problem that we're getting from the theft of catalytic converters.
Okay, our next question comes from Lisa. Lisa asks, what are you doing about the skyrocketing price of college tuition? The middle class can't afford to get a degree today.
I feel like I'm talking so much, but I guess I'm sorry. I'm going to talk again. Lisa, I think this is an area where we are so focused on this, and we are right there with you. So I mentioned at the outset that we passed a bill on to get a revolving student loan fund for Washington students, that they would have a 1% interest rate. And we already have the Washington College Grant, right, which provides students at lower income levels full tuition in a grant form here in Washington. One of the things, though, that we've discovered is there are a lot of students who are right on the bubble there, and so and of being able to get the college grant or not. So we increased the amount of income that a family could have this year in order to get the college grant. And we have a bill that does that. Representative Slatter's bill. She's chair of the higher ed committee. And the other thing that does is also let students use that grant money, not just for tuition and books, but for their housing, for their food, for transportation, because we were seeing that was something that was really pricing students out. And then for those who make maybe make a higher income, the revolving loan fund will help. And then the other two things I just want to mention is Representative Hansen had a bill to really do work to connect students more strongly with filling out the financial aid forms and give students more help in filling them out so that they can fully access the financial aid that's out there. And then finally, this is a little bit off, but I'm really excited that we did it because it has to do with healthcare workforce. We created a grant program for nurse educators so that we can get more nurses trained and working out in our community.
All right. Our next question comes from Tyler. Tyler asks, what's in the transportation package that got proposed? I know we touched a little bit on this earlier, but why don't we get some more detail about the transportation package?
Okay. Well, I could talk a long time about this, but let me just do the high-level highlights and the parts of the package that specifically relate to Pierce County. So this is a transformative package. Previous packages have been a lot about highways. This is a much more balanced proposal, and it really focuses on a more equitable and just transportation system. Fully a third of the investments are in active transportation, transit, or carbon reduction efforts that reduces the impact of carbon in the transportation arena. And so it does, with that money, it does fund some local projects. It funds a shared use trail all the way from Puyallup into the city of Tacoma. It invests in the area around the Tacoma Dome so that we have a more transit friendly facility there that will encourage both transit-oriented development, but also will be a high-quality transit area for the region. It funds some money for construction of a trail along Schuster Parkway, and that's the bulk of things for Pierce County on what I would call the multimodal or non-highway side. The transportation package is really split into the highway side is split up into a few areas. One is it provides funding to address the historical environmental problems with fish passages, which also we were required by the U.S. Supreme Court to fund fish passage replacements throughout Western Washington. It puts money to build 4 new ferry vessels and do other preservation work. And as you know, a lot of the problem associated with the ferries lately has been about workforce. It puts money into recruitment efforts, but recruitment efforts to particularly interest disadvantaged populations that heretofore have really never been a part of the employment scene for the ferry system. And it also, so it funds ferries. It also funds, in Pierce County, it funds the completion of Highway 167 into the Port of Tacoma, Highway 509 into the Kent Valley. It finishes the Port of Tacoma project for better traffic into the Port of Tacoma. And it will extend carpool lanes south from South 38th towards Joint Base Lewis McChord. And we have revolutionized our transit funding to provide more flexible funding that Pierce Transit will benefit from. It opens up their ability to be able to move to an electric fleet, and it enhances our special needs transportation for those folks where the traditional transit system isn't workable, and they need the help of the special needs transportation to be able to get to their medical appointments and other important essential transportation needs that they have. So there's a lot for Pierce County in this, but I have to say that is the most important thing is this is transformational, both in the investments in multimodal, but also the engagement to make sure that the transportation funds particularly benefit tribes and disadvantaged communities.
All right. Our next question comes from David. David asks, what are legislators doing to address the mental health crisis and high suicide rates in teenagers?
So I'm happy to take this one as someone who's serving on the Human Services Committee. I know there's been a lot of conversation, quite a few bills that we've seen just on how we can increase access to particularly behavioral health support, because I think mental health is part of that calculation. But when it comes to the student population, really thinking broadly about behavioral health is important. Candidly, I have a 14-year-old brother that has some significant special needs, and the issue of behavioral health, and for him as a freshman in high school, has been really on the top of mind. So I come from that perspective. But I think you'll see there's been a number of bills that have come from the Senate Behavioral Health Committee that are now going over that are now in the House, and I think look promising in terms of continued investment there. I've also had a number of meetings with folks from the Tacoma School District and Pierce County educators more broadly about their thoughts on where we could help with additional behavioral health supports, not just with school counselors in school settings, which is really desperately needed right now. And there's some investments in that, but I don't have the budget document to be able to cite to specifics, but also the importance of creating behavioral health supports that are outside of school settings, because I think a lot of the time we rely on our schools and our educators to address behavioral health issues that they frankly are just at capacity right now. So figuring out, to be able to invest in those community behavioral health areas, also increasing salaries for folks in behavioral health professions. I've got a bill specifically about behavioral health support specialists that's going to end up in some way in the budget. But it really looks at the opportunity to create lower barrier opportunities for folks to get into behavioral health without having to take on additional student loans and getting master's and doctorate level degrees, so we can get folks from our community working with students and folks more broadly. So hopefully that answers the question, but there's quite a bit happening in mental health, behavioral health, and specifically as it relates to students.
And I just add in, the House budget has $100 million new money for school counselors, for social workers. So that's a big investment to try and move these issues that Senator Trudeau talked about ahead.
Our next question comes from Tom. Tom asks, what are you doing this session to protect the environment and fight climate change?
Okay, so I didn't mention when I discussed the transportation package that when we passed the Climate Commitment Act and the low carbon fuel standards last legislative session, those pieces of legislation could not go into effect until a transportation package it gets implemented. So in our transportation package, the legislation will remove those barriers so that we can go full force with the implementation of the Climate Commitment Act, which sets up a cap and trade program that has reductions over time into how much carbon can be emitted in the state of Washington. And with the low carbon fuel standards, it sets an increasing requirement for fuels, including electricity, which is a clean fuel, a higher percentage over time of clean fuels being used in our transportation system. Those are the two landmark pieces of legislation, but we're addressing on a continuing basis the challenges that we have to encourage recycling and to address, reduce the need for packaging of various items. And then there is a host of environmental bills that try to address particularly the impacts of the climate on our fish and habitat, to make sure that we are providing for more resilience. It's kind of a never-ending process because we're under the 8 ball, so to speak, in addressing climate. We've lost some time and we need to make up for it. So you see a number of bills that will be moving their way through the legislature, including the building sector, the transportation sector, and industrial use of carbon-related fuels.
All right. The next question comes from Cheryl. And Cheryl's question is, what is being done regarding the crime, homelessness, street racing, and more to bring back our police officers and let them do their job with full support?
So as a vice chair of the Law and Justice Committee, I guess I'll kick this one off. Well, we spoke a little bit earlier about addressing housing and homelessness, and particularly the need for behavioral health and wraparound services to make sure that we're getting folks safely into housing and then transition into more supportive housing. As far as crime, I think there's a couple pieces in that question, but I know there were some bills last year that there were some technical corrections that were needed. A couple of those bills have actually already passed through the House and passed through the Law and Justice Committee related to, the types of non-lethal weapons that law enforcement can use. Those are highly negotiated. They were agreed upon. They went pretty smoothly through the House and then through our committee, and we expect them to go smoothly off the floor. There's also other bills, just again, clarifications where there was confusion about whether law enforcement could respond to folks in mental health crisis. Very highly negotiated throughout the interim. We expect those bills to pass off the Senate floor, not that they've been brought over by the House. There's a couple of bills that I think, if I can speak a little candidly in this space, where I think the messaging tends to be confusing. And that really is the applicability of officers to use of force, or when it's appropriate to use force. And so I would say that those are still in negotiations. There was a bill 2037 that was just heard in the Law and Justice Committee today. We'll see if there's any additional revisions to make sure that law enforcement has what they need to be able to do that job properly and have very clear guidelines available to them, because clarity is always helpful, especially for folks that are first responders and working in high crisis situations. But also where we want to make sure that our communities, particularly those that have been historically and disproportionately impacted by police violence, feel that their voices are heard and that we don't end up having any unintended consequences. So that's kind of what's happening in the universe of policing more broadly. I can't speak to street racing. I know that's a pretty local issue. And so I don't know if others want to comment to that piece, but that really is something that's under the purview and jurisdiction of the city of Tacoma. And I don't know that I'd feel comfortable speaking about it at the state level, but I'd say there's definitely a comprehensive look at the way that these issues are impacting each other. And that's part of the reason I can say personally that I wanted the 3 committees that I was on, so we weren't thinking in silos and we could really talk about the intersections of housing, providing adequate human services, and addressing public safety.
If I can add on the street racing, as part of the transportation package, we are allowing the local governments to do more with camera enforcement. What I've heard from local governments is they are very challenged by dealing with street racing because it crops up very quickly and it ends very quickly, and it's very difficult for them to get hard evidence on what has happened, and what people have been violating the law. So, and it's also a pretty non-discriminatory way of enforcement, because it's not identifying people by their race, for instance. It's more just the facts of who's on the camera and what they've been doing. So you'll see more camera enforcement, which hopefully will play a part in addressing street racing.
I guess I'll just kind of round out the comments by, noting that Senator Trudeau talked about some of the bills that we're working on this year. And really, I think the legislature's efforts have really been about building trust between law enforcement and communities and making sure that police have the necessary tools to investigate and to stop crime, but also to make sure that law enforcement is held accountable for their actions when they violate that trust. And I would say, Washington State's the number of killings of civilians in police custody decreased by 60% last year. So the work that we did, I think, worked well in that regard. And Senator Trudeau has talked about some of the other things. The other issue is that really law enforcement is primarily, other than the state patrol, the legislature does have responsibility for funding state patrol, but law enforcement is actually a local issue that is a county and city issue. So what we look to is the things that we can do to help. So for example, the House budget invests in going from like 30 Criminal Justice Training Commission classes to train members of the law enforcement community. We go up to 42 in 1 year, and then we add more in outgoing years. So that is so that we can make sure people get trained, but also that communities can bring in more police officers if they choose to, and that they'll have slots to be trained. I think it's interesting. My wife works in downtown Tacoma, and a couple of weeks ago, the place where she worked, the window on Pacific Avenue was broken out, and I know other people have had that happen. And I was really surprised to find out that that even though they know who the person is, that the Pierce County Jail is not booking people who are charged with burglary. They're just giving them summonses and telling them to return to court. So I got a question out to Pierce County about why that is happening. Because, obviously that kind of information travels amongst people. And so those are things that we need to work with the county and the city on to make sure that we're really able to do a comprehensive, appropriate law enforcement work.
We have another question that came in from YouTube. This is from D. Garrett. Budget for education system is good, but why aren't our children relieved of the mask requirement? Doesn't the legislature consider that an area within its responsibility? What should we expect?
I guess I'm going to start off here and say, if you think about the last 2 years of the pandemic, think about the differing approaches to masking that have been taken and that have been effective in the schools. I mean, one thing I would just note is the governor has lifted the mask mandate for schools, and that'll be effective, I think, on March 21st. So that's coming up. But legislation is a very, very blunt instrument, right? If we had passed a bill either requiring it or prohibiting it, then when we're not there, it means that you can't change that. And I don't think that this pandemic has confronted us in so many different ways. And again, hopefully we've beaten it back here. I would say there is a bill that's being considered, and I think it'll be moved out of committee tomorrow, addressing the governor's executive powers and making sure that, the legislature right now has the power, if we so choose, to repeal any of his proclamations. We can do that, but also allows the Four Corners leadership, meaning the leaders, the Republican and Democratic leaders in the House and the Senate. The bill would allow us, I guess I'm obviously one of those, would allow us to take that action when the legislature is not in session if we feel that needs to happen. So we'll see how that bill fares. I expect it to come out of committee, and it's already come over from the Senate. So that is a way that I think we step up as a legislature and say we are responsible for governance also. But I work in public health in my other career, and masking has been proven over and over and over again to be a very effective way to avoid getting COVID.
Our next question is from Ted. Ted is asking, I haven't heard anything about the role and amount of the federal infrastructure funds. Where and on what projects in Washington will those federal funds be directed?
I guess that's for me largely. So the federal infrastructure funds basically for the next 5 years approximately doubles the amount of dollars we've received from the federal government for transportation for the previous 5 years. So although it isn't all devoted to transportation, some of it's devoted to broadband, some of it's devoted for other infrastructure like water systems. On the transportation, I can tell you how we've dealt with that. We have all the money that comes directly into the state. We basically have programmed that for preservation and maintenance of the existing highway roadways. And a good deal of that doubling of the funding is actually for what are called competitive programs. So that means state and local governments will compete for specific projects, whether it is, and we hope to be very successful with helping to fund the interstate bridge between Vancouver and Portland with some federal money. We hope to get as much as $1 billion for that, but for other bridges across the state of Washington as well. The challenge, of course, is it's competitive. So we're going to try to set up our revenues so that we can provide some assistance to locals to capture more than our fair share of that transportation money that will be available on a competitive basis. But as I said, it's an unsure amount of money, but the money that we know we can count on will be put into preservation and maintenance. I see that there's a question from Scott, and I'll answer this quickly since I see it up on the screen. We are putting additional money with our regular supplemental budget. We are putting more money into litter cleanup along the highways. He's right. It's a problem. It needs to be addressed, and we're providing additional resources in our supplemental budget.
I'll just add on in the other two budgets, one of the things that's very important for us to think about with the federal dollars is that is one-time money flowing into this state. It's a lot of money, but it's one-time money. So you can't do things like I talked very early on about teacher COLAs, right? You wouldn't want to fund teacher COLAs with that money because you don't have it after a year, right? So you want to invest it wisely in things where a one-time investment is going to make a big deal. That's why it went to transportation. But I also mentioned at the outset $500 million that was transferred from the operating budget to the capital budget for housing. That is a lot of federal money that's helping that. We also have workers, especially in the long-term care setting, who are receiving hazard pay right now because of the work that they're doing with very high-risk patients. And so that's something that one-time only money is used for, and other things like rental assistance and utility assistance. So things like that can be used but that don't have an ongoing cost year over year are where we look to use the federal dollars that came in.
All right, we have a question from Doreen. Doreen's question is, how are you supporting the significant legislation to better access and fund disability services in Washington this session?
I'll go ahead and take that one. And I actually really appreciate the question. As mentioned earlier, this is a really personal issue to me as someone who has been a caretaker both formally and informally for my mother and my brother who have disabilities both intellectually and physically. So there's a number of really good bills. There's also some really good investment in both of the budgets. I'd highlight a couple. So in the Senate operating budget, there's about $5 million for school to work. There's also increased rates for our community providers who are working to help support our disabled family members and community members as they transition into working and provide those adequate supports. There's also, I know, legislation that's coming over from the House that we haven't heard yet in Human Services, and looking forward to some of those. And I don't know if others want to speak to those bills, but I'll tell you, there's an incredible advocate here in the 27th. Her name is Adrienne Stewart, and she doesn't let us forget any of the bills in this space. So really, really grateful for that. And also one that increases personal allowances for folks with disabilities that are really in the margins. I mean, living off of, $1,000 to maybe $1,500 a month in total. So it would increase the allowance for those personal care services, so people don't have to choose between getting an upgraded a wheelchair, for instance, versus eating that month. So I think that these are all really critical supports that we're doing, and happy to dive in if folks have specific questions. But I would say that that goes in line with what the speaker had mentioned earlier, and making sure that those that are most vulnerable going into the pandemic, really that they're stabilized and able to come out of the pandemic in a better spot that they were in before they were disproportionately impacted by a lot of the same issues that have impacted us all.
All right. We are getting close to the end of our hour. We have had a lot of great questions tonight. But just for everybody still watching, if we did not get to your question, you can directly reach out to each of the legislators' offices. Their contact information is going to be on the screen at the end of the town hall. We're so thankful for everybody who joined. And I think we will wrap things up with, there was a question posted to the speaker's Facebook page from Julie. And Julie's question is, I'm curious about what each of you are excited about this session. And so I think I'll turn it back over to the legislators to answer that question as they wrap things up.
Who wants to start? Well, I'll start. I'll just say, I'm Speaker of the House, so I don't prime sponsor any bills anymore. So all the bills are my babies. But I would say that one of the things I'm really excited about is serving with Rep. Phi and Senator Trudeau. We have very diverse interests, but between the three of us, we cover a lot of bases. And Rep. Phi's leadership on a transportation package, something that is so needed here in the state of Washington, is amazing. And Senator Trudeau's work on all of the human service issues and the law and justice issues could not be covered any better by anyone else. So beyond that, I am very, very excited about both our capital and our operating budgets and how much they are investing in Washingtonians and in the services that Washingtonians say that they need and they deserve. Washingtonians deserve these services. And with these kinds of investments, I just feel really good about us all coming out of this stronger.
I guess I'll just go next and saying I'm so new. I'm kind of excited by everything. But I'll say that, stepping from someone who's advocated on the outside and stepping on the inside, I think what excites me is, to echo the comments of the speaker and working with my seatmates, but just seeing the way that, the Democratic caucus is really been pushing for people first and making sure that that's really at the center of every conversation. And that just feels really affirming to know that that's what's happening on the inside when, for many advocates on the outside, that's the hope that's what's there. So I just feel really excited to be a part of all of these discussions and honored to represent the 27th. And yeah, so as a newbie, just excited all the way around. So I'll defer to Chair Phi if he wants to close us out.
Well, I have to say I've got two very wonderful teammates in working for the 27th Legislative District, and I really welcome Senator Trudeau to that team. She's already proven herself well in her first legislative session. I have to be excited about the transportation package. It's revolutionary for the state of Washington, but it's also revolutionary for the, I think, entire country by putting the emphasis on serving all communities, particularly disadvantaged communities, addressing multimodal needs so it's a transportation system for all. And by having it go along with an aggressive climate reduction strategy that opens the door for hopefully a better future from a climate standpoint than we otherwise would have. And I'm just so glad to be playing a small part in making all of that happen. So it's great to see all of you tonight. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great evening.